I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us for today's Diversity Masterclass. We're going to talk about university recruiting and inclusive interviews for software engineers. My name is Portia Kibble-Smith, and I'm the Director of D&I at Karat. And at Karat, our mission is to make every interview predictive, fair, and enjoyable. And let me tell you a little bit about what our agenda is going to be today. We'll go through our intros, why university recruiting actually matters. We want to set candidates up for success, talk about building a diverse UR program, creating inclusive hiring processes, and of course, we're going to have a Q&A. So I'd love for everybody to continue to use the chat room for our Q&A. And I know that over the last few months, fairness has taken on an extra importance all around the world. And people once again are seeing the way that most companies hire software engineers we know is broken. At Karat, though, we're here to help organizations improve the way they hire software engineers, again, by making things predictive, fair, and enjoyable. So today we'll talk about some of the best organizations, what some of them are doing to make their engineering hiring more inclusive, because diverse software engineering teams, they don't just magically happen. They are built intentionally. So many successful programs start off with university recruiting programs that cultivate a diverse talent pipeline by going beyond what the traditional top 10 schools are. And they include HBCUs as well as HSIs. And for those of you who are not familiar with the terms, it is historically Black colleges and universities and Hispanic serving institutions. Successful programs also usher candidates through an inclusive and consistent interviewing process that mitigates bias and helps students show off what they really can do. And that's what we want. In this webinar today, we're going to share some approaches that help companies build and maintain relationships with a diverse set of schools. And we'll offer insights on how you can make interviewing and hiring processes a lot more inclusive than what they are today. So I'm going to turn things over to our panelists for their introductions. And let's start. We can start first with Luce.
Hi everyone. I'm Lucen Mendel. I'm the Director of Developer Relations at Karat. I actually joined Karat 4 years ago as an interview engineer. My background's in engineering, I guess interviewing as a hiring manager. And at Karat, I've become very involved in, I started out figuring out how do we interview for interview engineers? Like what does it mean to perform a good interview? And I've gotten very involved in the question creation, and now I give talks and workshops on interviewing best practices.
All right. And next, Alexa.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alexa Friedman, and I manage the university recruiting program for all of our interns and new grads at Databricks. And before I was here, I was in higher ed, so on the other side of the table, working with students, preparing them for their academic and career paths. So I've spent my entire career working with students just from all different perspectives. So I love having this conversation because it touches on so many different areas.
All right, and Trisha.
Hi everyone, I'm Trisha Lincoln. I'm the technology recruiting manager for Lowe's Tech. We've recently started a technology transformation, so hiring engineers is a little bit new to our company. So that's why I joined. I wanted to be a part of something new. Prior to that, I've spent over a decade in tech, a lot like Alexa, spending a lot of time with early in career, with students, with interns. And I'm really, really passionate about that talent, about growing it. Most recently, before Lowe's, I was with Citrix, where I oversaw not only our university team, but also our diversity recruiting initiatives and our inclusive hiring practices. So it's something that I'm super passionate about. TA is a great place to be because we can really help influence a lot of the organization. So I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Well, we're certainly excited to have all our great panelists here. And I know that university recruiting is so critical, especially when we're talking about our D&I initiatives. And you're probably wondering, so why is that so? Well, one reason is there's an opportunity to target a known diverse population, like as I mentioned earlier, like at HBCUs. This actually helps establish a longer-term employer brand, in my opinion, by building the brand affinity early in a software engineer's career. Once they get to know you and you're coming to campus, they'll know your brand and they'll know that you have interest. So how do you approach finding the right schools? outside of your existing network. Because I know everyone's leadership team probably says, here's a school that you need to go to, here's what we need to do. Well, I think you need to get data driven. Look at the performance of your current engineers. And if that isn't helpful, just start recruiting from new schools with actually a known diverse population. That's fairly easy to do. But I think a lot of companies shy away from that. And we want to talk about how that absolutely helps build the more inclusive environment. So when you're going to those new institutions, how do you cultivate the right relationships? I'll let my panelists give some thoughts there, but my approach has always been to be intentional. You have to be persistent. And above anything else, you've got to network. Don't treat diversity recruiting as if it's a different function outside of the whole recruiting realm. Give it the same level of resources and respect and attention as you would if you were going to Stanford or Carnegie Mellon. In addition to establishing a diverse talent pipeline, it's critical that every candidate experiences an enjoyable and inclusive interview process. I say when you're going on campus, you're really buying votes. You want to talk about how you can create a great environment at your company and and just make them interested in having more conversations with you and learning more about your organization. What I'd like to do is turn things over to Luce to give you at least how we can set up candidates to succeed.
Thanks, Portia. Yeah, I just want to say a few words about how to level the playing field and how to set up candidates to succeed, specifically with interviews. And I want to share a few candidate stories and kind of talk about some of the things that candidates run into, because it's kind of a problem in our industry, or at least in terms of perception, where candidates, we want to hire people to be successful on the job. And sometimes people get concerned that I could be successful in the job, but I'm having trouble in this interview. Like, are we just assessing people for interview skills and experience and, that sort of thing. And so some of the gotchas that that I've seen, and this is based on at Karat, we've done over 70,000 technical assessments. That's a collection of interview engineers, not me personally. I've done maybe only a few hundred. And also getting feedback from those interviews. 60% of Karat candidates leave us feedback, and we don't share that with the hiring companies. So it's, they know it's not going to impact the hiring decision. It's really just an honest conversation with us. And then also, of course, in some of the diversity and inclusion initiatives that I've worked on with Portia, where we do workshops and interview prep directly with students at HBCUs and HSIs. So I get to hear from students directly some of the things they run into. So here's the three things that I think can really impact interview performance, especially from students and underrepresented candidates. The first is being nervous and bombing a question that they can do on their own when it's not a high stakes 1 hour timed conversation with a stranger. Just choking in the interview. And that's, of course, that's just noise. It's not very helpful for the assessment. And we even hear that from all sorts of candidates today, especially where people are maybe being laid off, or these are difficult or unusual times, and there's just added stress and pressure on a lot of these interviews. Students, everything's changing for them right now, and what's the fall going to be like? My internship got canceled, all these things. So that's, I think, one of the biggest problems specifically right now is just nervousness and candidates bombing questions that they otherwise would be all right with. The second thing is misunderstanding the question, giving maybe the right answer to the wrong question. That just adds noise. It's not very helpful. And in students in particular, they're learning these skills, but programming at such a broad discipline that they're having to apply these skills in lots of different contexts that for us in industry, it might seem very obvious. We do this every day. I've asked this question 50 million times. I have an answer key. And so it's very easy though for students, and I'm often telling them, it's okay to be confused at the beginning of an interview. It's the most vulnerable time. That's part of the process, but that's a big thing that students tell me, especially on sometimes there's like coding challenges and they just feel like this is very confusing. I don't even know who to turn to. The third thing is getting stuck, on something, and then, the remaining time of the assessment, like they can't move forward, they can't demonstrate their skills. And this especially impacts students and underrepresented students who maybe already have some, perceptions of like systemic, of like standardized tests, and just it's very easy or that they don't belong in this industry. And so it's very easy for students to want to give up, or, or quit when they get stuck. And even in an interview, when you're trying to coach someone through that, how do you make use of the full interview time? So I just want to share a few things that can help with those, specific gotchas. And that's that as interviewers, everything we're saying or doing during an interview, like even our body language, is going to communicate one of these three things. We can clarify the question and make sure that we're not introducing noise by the candidate just being confused and doing the wrong thing. We can trying to maximize that signal and assess the competencies that we're really interested in. So anytime we can clarify misunderstandings, clarify the question, that can really help. Clarify the objective of the interview, because also candidates and students get all sorts of weird advice or no advice. And so, just telling them, actually, this is what I'm looking for. This is what would be helpful. This is what would be signal, not noise. The second thing, of course, is giving encouragement and support to help settle someone's nerves and just help them perform their best. And at Karat, we also do redos. Like, that is, if a candidate feels like, oh, I just bombed this interview, oh no, like, hey, just do it again with the different questions, different interviewer, schedule it for another time when you're, calmer and things are going well. And, what's one more hour for the potential to hire this wonderful employee for the next few years. And also that can just take the pressure off the first interview to be like, oh, it's not all or nothing. And the last thing, of course, is giving hints. This is very specific to technical interviews. How can we just move someone forward so that we can assess other strengths and abilities? And that in the feedback we receive from candidates, that's one of the biggest things that candidates tell us, is just, even if they know they didn't do well in the interview, they just feel so happy and appreciative to have this nice interaction with an interviewer, and even to learn something, or to feel like they had a partner in this stressful endeavor who was helping them out. That can just make a big difference. And they're gonna tell their friends. They're gonna have a great relationship with your company, even if most of our customers are not going to be happy, because we don't end up hiring everyone. So it's a difficult situation. But I hope some of those tips helped, and I'm going to turn it back over to Portia.
All right, thanks so much, Luz. Those were great tips. Absolutely. What I'd like to do now is actually have a conversation with Alexa. We'll start with Databricks, and I'm just curious, Alexa, how does Databricks actually choose the schools that you target?
Yeah, great question. While I'm talking, I'd love if people could put in the chat if they're calling in from a university recruiting team, just so we know who's calling in from UR. So how do we select schools? Databricks, just to give some context, I've been here about 2 years, and before me, there wasn't a lot of structured university programming. So this was, when I joined, it was one of the first times that we were building out our programs. And so, like many tech companies, especially in the Bay Area, a lot of our university hiring was based on where founders and alumni went to school, which is a great place to start. Like Portia said, networking is essential, and that's where the networks are. As we consider growing our programs, though, and especially as we want to build a very diverse cohort of both interns and new grads, it's important to grow our list of schools. And so the way that we do that is a very data-driven approach. I'm sure that all different companies take different approaches and different philosophies on this, but for us, it's really important to have the data to show how students can perform. And the best way of being able to put students through, because it can become a bit of a chicken or the egg situation. Something that I get asked a lot is, well, if I'm not allowed to go to these schools, how am I going to get students into the pipeline in order to prove out that they can be successful? And a great way of doing that is by expanding access to your application pool, expanding access to your events, which in the past has been really challenging, but this year, as I'm sure most people are entirely virtual, that's not an issue anymore. And so that's something we're really excited about, because now we can really expand access to our events because they're all virtual anyways. And then the third way is through top of funnel coding challenges and things like that. I'm sure we'll talk more about inclusive interviewing practices and wanting to take a holistic view on candidates. We don't want to over-index on anything too much, but we find that when we do include something like a coding challenge or Karat, that does expand access and gives us that data that we need to show to our leadership that students from many different backgrounds are very successful in our interviews, which then allows us to expand. So it can take some time, but the data is out there.
That's great. Well, I'm just curious. I mean, I know how difficult sometimes it is to bring other people along. Are there stakeholders that you feel like you need to bring along, especially when you're starting to build a new pipeline at a new school.
Yes, absolutely. So we are very lucky to have a lot of involvement from our most senior leadership. Our co-founders and our CEO are very involved and very enthusiastic about university recruiting. That also means that they have strong opinions about what the programs look like. And so it's wonderful to have their support. They also, of course, care a lot about where we're hiring. And so in order to bring them along, that's really where data is essential. Because I think a lot of us have spent time in UR or have spent time on campus researching and learning about the education landscape and care a lot about this. And at the end of the day, having data is going to be what brings them on board. And so that's where showing interview pipeline performance, intern performance when they intern with us, job performance if they join us as a new grad can be really influential. And so that's where partners that I work with are on the people team or HR and other like performance evaluation teams. And then we work with our engineering team or hiring team to get them on board to expand where we recruit from.
Oh, great. Well, I know when you're trying to build those new relationships, tell me what are some of the successful things that you've done to create the new relationships? And then also what some of the pitfalls have been when that other recruiting leaders need to keep in mind.
Yeah, I loved that one of the things you said, Portia, was persistence.
Right.
That is key. So networking is really essential, but students turn over. So even if you have a good network, it's really easy to drop that, even just by like losing contact for a semester because the student leadership turns over. And so persistence is very key. Students are busy. They have a ton of outreach from different companies. And so that's definitely the first one. And then the biggest thing that I like to emphasize is being really authentic. We can send emails to every single student group at every single campus, but that won't allow us to have really authentic conversations with students. And it's much more important to develop those solid relationships than casting a wide net here, especially when we're talking about working with student groups that are aimed at recruiting a diverse workforce, women in computer science, NSBE, things like that. So what I often do is, what I always do is reach out to our internal stakeholders first. So other engineers or even folks outside of our engineering team. Just for context, our UR programs are only within engineering at the moment. But I'll ask folks what kinds of programs they were involved in school. A lot of them are still involved as alumni, and so that's a much more authentic way of connecting with students than just having me, not an engineer, reach out and try to engage that way. And then related to that is just being really clear about what we're looking for. We hire for a very specific type of engineer, and so we like to be very honest with students about what we're looking for so that we can manage expectations appropriately.
Okay, great. Well, I know when you're going to a new campus and you don't have any history at that campus, I'm curious as to how do you build those inroads and have the brand affinity that you want on campus at a new school?
It's hard. I don't know who's familiar with Databricks, but it's a super technical product that does not have as much of the brand appeal as many other companies that are more customer facing. I'll be honest, I didn't know what we did before I started working here. And so that can be hard for students as well when they're inundated with information from companies that are a lot more accessible to them. And so getting involved on a new campus is just really difficult. And one of the hardest things to learn in all things life is that there's no replacement for time. It can take time to build out those relationships. Like maybe the first year we just do a cold reach out and do one event that turns out okay. But then in my experience, you can grow from that. If you hire one student or even just connect with one student who just develops an interest, you can grow from there. So it does take time. And that's why changing up your target schools is important as we diversify. But it's also important to maintain consistent relationships with those core schools or core, it doesn't even have to be schools, core majors, core departments, core like community groups, because that's how that sustained impact is really going to develop those closer relationships that will net out more hires and more value add for the students over time.
Yeah. And Alexa, I've always found that having I call them a brand ambassador on campus. So if I can find some student that I can say, hey, you can, well, in this environment, you can't really bring people together for a pizza party. But in the past, maybe next spring, we can do something like that. That always pays too, to have somebody else stand up and say, well, I know Alexa, and this is what's happening at Databricks. And it always makes a difference.
Yes, absolutely.
And I know, at Databricks, you're a very forward-thinking company, and I know you're really competing for high bar engineering talent with some of the biggest tech companies out there on the whole planet, not just in the Bay Area. Uh, have you found going to outside of your traditional top 10 schools, I say the top 10 CS programs, gives you a competitive advantage? If you look
Yes.
outside of those schools,
Yes.
yes.
So this is exactly what I was touching on before, that it can take time and data to bring your leadership along with you, and that's normal and that's okay. That's like the first thing I wish someone had told me years ago when I started this, that immediately I was like, I know a lot about access and equity in education, and I know that we need to expand, and leadership was like, well, but why? That, not even in Databricks, any company, it can be a bit of a big change to think about. And so it's okay if it takes a while to gather that data and make your case. And it's okay to make incremental changes. You don't have to overhaul your entire university program right away. You're doing good work. That's my advice to anybody who's making changes on your end. So we have seen a lot of success by expanding our pool. We do not limit the schools where students come from. So we will not reject based on school. So that has helped, that philosophy has helped us a lot. And that is exactly why using, whether it's a coding challenge or an open event, which again, virtual should help. By doing that, that allows us to look at a student holistically rather than rejecting just based on a school. So that's seen a lot of positive effects. And then again, incrementally, we've been able to collect data on how successful those students are, and they're very successful. And then we've made some of the schools they come from part of our core schools list. So we recruit, from anywhere now because we're not traveling, but if we're to consider our core schools where we'll spend a lot more time being proactive in our outreach, it expands out into top 30 to 50. And again, we're not restrictive. We'll hire from anywhere.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
I was just curious. One of the things I'm curious about, and that's a question, Tricia, I'll ask you as well, is what are you doing differently, especially for this fall recruiting that when everyone is virtual? Any tidbits on things that other university relations teams can do differently that might at least differentiate you from others?
Oh man, we're all flying blind here.
I know
I've been to a lot of these panels, and a lot of times I come away thinking, wow, they know exactly what they're doing, and they seem to have it all together, almost like they've lived this exact experience before, but we haven't. So deep breaths. What we're doing is kind of like I talked about before, we're focusing on opening up access. We think this is a huge opportunity that's going to change what university recruiting looks like. So we're pretty excited about it. So we're going to focus a lot less on target schools. So that's why I kind of laughed that I talked about target schools that we're not really thinking about for this year, because we think this is a great opportunity to open it up. And then also we have partnered with Portia and Lowe's plug to do a lot of workshops on technical interviewing, which are so popular. Students love it. And for us, we figure we would much rather give students a value add experience, even if they don't end up applying for Databricks. This is a really tough time. Students have lost their internships. They've had full-time roles rescinded. We just want to give something back to the community because we know we'll get our hires. So we want to focus our efforts on giving value add to students.
That's great. That's great to hear. All right. Thank you, Alexa. And Tricia, I'm going to turn over to you. And I know that one of the things that I love about you is that you've always championed live interviews as being more inclusive and compared to over-indexing on coding tests. Tell me why you felt that way.
Well, for me, it was really about, when I worked at Citrix in particular, we were noticing that we had a problem not only attracting, but throughout the process, keeping a diverse population of students in particular, but also experienced engineers in the pipeline. And as we started doing research, we found a number of a lot of research articles that cited just the difference in how people approach tests. and there's just this coldness to taking exams, and how different populations approach them differently, everywhere from being afraid to answer incorrectly, so you don't answer at all, to just perhaps somebody else grew up in an environment where they were really encouraged to take risks and there was no consequence, so they might get partial credit and get a little bit further. And so we wanted to find ways to infuse in-person interviews so we could understand how people were thinking about these problems. How do they pull in others to solve problems? What questions do they ask? Because the right answer is fantastic, but how you get to that answer is so important. And that is what was really, we were finding lost in these coding assessments and in these coding challenges. And so it's funny, right now we're going through, again, I mentioned at Lowe's, we're building up our muscle around engineering interviewing. And I see sort of, kind of, well, let's try some assessments. And then you go through and you get the feedback and they're like, yeah, I really wish that I had had an opportunity to talk with them. So I just want to talk to them anyway. And it keeps coming back to those live in-person interviews that give people a chance to showcase their whole kind of persona, if you will, who we are as people and how we approach these problems.
That's great. From an employer brand standpoint, what are the steps that you take to ensure that candidates really have a positive experience during the interview process?
Yeah, so I think it all starts, for me, I think one of the biggest foundations is consistency and just setting expectations. I think the more that people can know and more candidates can understand how they can prepare, what they can do to show up well, the more trust you can build throughout the process. And so really it's about being treated fairly. You react positively to brands where you feel like you're being treated fairly and you feel like you're given the same shot as everyone else. So making sure as you're going through, and it's in every organization, small, medium, large, where you have these differences of how people like to interview. But when you can pull your interviews together and you can start to inform them about why consistent process is so important, why it's so important for us to treat people the same and to treat them fairly, they start to get on board with, oh, I'm contributing to a larger culture in my organization of people who are willing to speak up, people who feel like their managers treat them fairly, and so they're willing to raise questions. And I was smiling earlier when you were asking Alexa about finding champions and sponsors in the business for university recruiting. It's really the same for interviewing, because some people see it as a task or a box that they're trying to check off, but this is really a way that you can improve your organization. And so when you can get hiring managers, leaders, and interviewers on board with what they're doing for the brand, when they provide those positive interview experiences, the better it can kind of be for everyone, especially our candidates that we want so much to consider us. And even if they don't come or they don't get an offer, we want it to be positive. We want them to say, I had a great experience and I connected with this brand.
Right. And that's really how you build your brand. I mean, I think about it, when you're interviewing a candidate, they're also interviewing you.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
your interviewers absolutely make a huge difference in the way they, think about the company, their experiences, the whole bit. So interviewing is absolutely essential. Just curious as to what metrics do you use to measure your DEI program success? I know
Yeah,
sometimes it's difficult.
yeah, it can be really, really tricky. And so when I was thinking about that question and kind of preparing for this and thinking through different ways, because everyone's at different points. You've got organizations that are government contractors who have specific rules they can follow. You've got legal teams that take different approaches on how they practice reporting and metrics around these things. So I kind of thought of a different way, rather than hard metrics where, which are the ones we kind of all know about, of what are the percentage of X, Y, and Z that you hire. I thought about it a little bit differently in terms of how well is your organization really tracking to achieving interview consistency, and really inclusiveness within your organization. So looking at, of course, your diverse interview slate. So are you showing up and representing everyone who works in your organization? So do you have interview slates that are, 30% or more as kind of a baseline that we use? And that's not only for the candidates to be able to see, maybe someone who looks like them and be able to say, this is a place where I can be, but also for your employees to feel like I have input into who's coming into this organization. So looking at your interview slates, looking at your interview, panels themselves, are you representing just people who would be direct peers to these people you're interviewing? Or are you thinking about all the stakeholders? Because really it takes, a community to build products, and it takes a lot of different things, and you want input from everyone to be able to say, this is someone that we think would really add value to our entire organization. Some other things to think about. This is something I think we all struggle with, looking at your referrals. It's one thing to say we want to be inclusive, but it's another when the referrals that come in consistently don't reflect that we have a network that's beyond just the one that we have and that's close to us. And so that can sometimes help also with those leadership conversations. Hey, you want this, but this is what you're giving back to us. And
Right.
so that's one that you can really help change that conversation with people, and thinking about what are you doing to bring in, and what are you doing to build inclusiveness, to make sure everyone feels that they have a voice throughout the process, and also with our existing employees. And then really thinking about your job postings. Are they you-centric? Are they taking out gender bias, other biases that may be based on socioeconomic factors or based on where people went to school? Alexa probably sees a lot of different non-traditional profiles in the early and career talent, and building job descriptions that really are skill-based and make people say, not only can I work there, I want to work there, because they'll value what's different about me. And then really following up on your trainings. It's one thing to build trainings, but then it's another to really follow up and say, hey, of these 3 organizations, this one's 100%, this one's 50%, this one's 30%. Why is that? Why don't we have participation? Because again, those informed interviewers, for me, I think in the teams that I've been on, I think that can really change the narrative, because you have, as they start to get on board, you have more and more advocates to help you with building your metrics. And so over time, you can start to use those sort of data points to see the story about where you are with inclusive interviews and where you are with building inclusion in your organization.
Yeah, it takes a whole village, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How much do you weigh hiring for potential versus hiring for existing skill sets, especially when you're talking about early career candidates, some who may not have even had any work experience other than a summer internship, but certainly have the desire and can learn fast, but how do you even prove that in the interviewing process?
Yeah.
So just curious.
Yeah, and that's also depending on where people are at, because if you have folks that are saying, I want to hire an intern, or I want to hire an early in career engineer to do X task, that's different from I want to take early in career talent to help grow to achieve my future outcomes. And so if you've got teams that are bought into those future outcomes, you can definitely, I think it's important to weigh that I call it hiring on potential. It's so important to weigh that equally with skills, because at the end of the day, especially if you're going to university campuses, in our university team, Toria Welts runs our university team, and they do a phenomenal job of this. And they say it to me all the time. They're like, hey, all these students take the same classes. They're all passing them. They're all having the same professors. So we know their baselines are good. They're getting great education. That's why we're going to these schools. We wouldn't be going otherwise. So we know they have the skills. So what's next? The next thing is, what's their potential? What's their, how inquisitive are they? How much do they want to solve these problems? Where do they see themselves in 3, 5, 10 years? And it may not even be at our company. It may be at another company, but that sort of understanding of their potential and where they see themselves really helps you to understand what they can achieve and how they can help you be better. Because we all left school, we graduated, we started working, and unless you're continuing to go to classes, you're losing that newness, that freshness, that, oh, I just learned this, that inquisitiveness, and that goes away with time. And so that early career talent is a great way to bring that back into your organization, and hiring on potential and weighing that out and considering that is so important, because that, what they have, that spark, is what brings it in. Now, for managers and organizations, especially those that have immediate needs, those skills and can they accomplish it might be a route they want to take. So if they're not thinking beyond the 3-month scope of the internship or the 6-month scope of the co-op, that might be a little bit different, because you do have to have managers and leadership who are invested in growing that potential.
Right, absolutely. I'm curious as to the one thing that you feel like, we've got several companies out here listening for, your pearls of wisdom. And what's the one thing that companies can start doing tomorrow to make their interview and hiring processes more inclusive? What would you say?
Yeah, I would say the one thing is to partner with your DEI organization and your DEI team. And if you are not only talent acquisition, but you're also HR and you're also the DEI team, then you set the standard on what your organization or your company is trying to achieve when it comes to this. And so the reason I say that is it is so easy to, and everyone has the best intentions, be going in so many different directions, and then it takes away from the momentum that you can achieve. And so it's so important to understand, what are the segments that are underrepresented at our company? Like, what are those populations that we really need to bring in that talent, that we can help build better products, that we can help understand how our brand can be more appealing to people. And then additionally, how can that makes us better, right? And so understanding how you can contribute to the greater good by partnering with your DEI team, I think, is one of the first things that you can do. And then once you understand what's their mission, what are they trying to accomplish, now as part of talent acquisition, we're that tip of the spear. We're the very first entry point. We're the application is the first thing people see unless they're getting referred. Those interviewers are the first people that, they see as they're going through the process. And so now you start to train your interviewers around the issues and the problems that we're trying to address as a larger organization, and they start to be able to contribute to this larger message. The other thing is that team generally has great line of sight into the overall community that you can showcase, which we know so much about recruiting, especially for early in career, is, can I see myself at this company? And so the DEI teams generally do a fantastic job of really curating all that information and saying, these are all the things, all the resources that we have. Here's, phenomenal resource groups that you can use. Here's what we want to, and if it's a smaller, organization, here's where we want to be in the future. Here's what we're building towards. You can start to bring those folks in that are really passionate about it to help you with your recruiting. And so I think it is just really critical to partner with the DEI team. And if you are, then you set that standard and you communicate that across the organization as the standard for what it means for not only talent acquisition, but also, existing employees and associates as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for sharing. My last question for you, outside of when we open it up for Q&A, is, again, what's the one thing that you would say you're going to do differently in this virtual environment during the interview process? Because I know that's going to be different than in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. So Toria and team, I think, have taken a pretty good approach. They had to shift pretty quickly to virtual internships, just as Alexa was talking about, which is interesting at a retail company, a brick and mortar retail company for sure. So they did a great job of switching that up. It was, at first we were thinking, isn't it a shame they won't have these connections with customers? Because that's really, our engineers are here to serve our customers at Lowe's, and they were able to find virtual meetups, be able to connect them with customers virtually and sort of give them sort of a virtual but safe experience, because obviously the health and safety of everyone right now is kind of primary. And then as they've been thinking about going to campus, they've really been looking towards those champions, right? So where do we have, where are the schools that we know, and they do a great job as well of the sort of like big schools and then the non-traditional schools as well, where do we have champions and alumni that bring that passion? Because when we're in these virtual environments, you can tell, right? You can tell who's excited to be there and you can tell who's not. And so making sure that they have those champions to be able to, get excited about bringing folks back from their alma maters or giving back to communities that they came from has been, I think, pretty critical in kind of getting energy around this. Because usually people are excited to get on a plane. And now we need people who are excited to get on Zoom. And so, or Teams or whatever it may be. And so I think that's something that they've been doing, is really focusing not on the logistics of it, but the energy of it, if you will, and how can they find people that are going to bring something extra to this really unique environment that we're in.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, with that, what I'd love to do, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I'd love to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. So if you have questions of our panelists, I'd love for you to put in the chat room, and then we'll go from there. So let's open it up. I know that somebody has a question.
While we wait for questions, something I'd like to, I guess, tack on to everything Trisha's been saying is that I recommend starting there. Start with building inclusive interview practices. Start with understanding if your team wants to hire interns for tasks or for future growth. Start with understanding what skills students need versus what we're okay with mentoring for growth, because without that, it's really hard to build those authentic, lasting partnerships on campus and to grow your target school list or whatever you're doing with your campus program. So I really recommend starting inside to make sure you've got a hard lock on your champions and your interview practices before expanding your UR programs.
You bet. Okay, I think people are being a little shy. So I'm open to questions. All right, here's a Q&A right here. Let's see. Any thoughts or suggestions on how you can change the hearts and minds with managers on the value of hiring for potential and early talent? She said, they said, I find that managers struggle with this, and that oftentimes the results is then, leaning on their practices for hiring experienced talent, and they're not really looking at the potential. Anybody want to jump in there?
I can jump in. This is a challenge with early talent because you'll always have a mix. You'll have a mix of managers who are really excited and have experience mentoring for future growth, and then other managers who are maybe a little underwater with everything they're working on and need somebody to come in and just get things done. And I think similar to what Trisha was talking about, like, it's okay to have a mix. What's going to be most useful to you in making changes, moving towards a building for growth program, is finding champions internally. So if you're hiring for an engineering or a sales organization, it's going to be a lot more impactful coming from a manager who makes that case than coming from recruiting. So working on it together and making that case to the larger and leadership team is going to be really useful.
And one thing I've found in the past, and it depends on where your organization is at, but if you are in an organization that's been around for at least a couple of cycles of interns in particular, or college hiring, it goes a long way to showcase successful college hires and early in career talent, and say, look at the product they built, look at what they contributed to, look at this customer success story. And then, I mean, sometimes people can over-index and say, well, I only want, early in career talent, and I only want this profile because they did such a good job. But really showcasing and celebrating those successes, along with Alexa, talking about champions, that tends to really give some, managers in particular, a sticky, real situation for them to see what's possible if they interview in that way.
Okay, thank you. Now, here's a question. What's the best way to engage with universities when you tend to focus on hiring individuals with 1 to 3 years of production experience? Should we even consider it? I say yes, but I'd love to hear from you.
The age-old question. There are, and I'll let Alexa, as definitely I look to you as the expert Alexa right now, but there's a lot of talent in universities. There's a lot of people going to university for different reasons. There's a lot of people doing non-traditional advanced degrees. A lot of those folks who are doing the non-traditional routes or who are doing different programs in universities are working at the same time. And so when you're looking for experience, but also looking for a university, I find that they're there. And in fact, a lot of times they might not meet qualifications for traditional early in career roles because they have too much experience. And so I definitely think it's worth it. I think that you just have to be specific about what you're looking for. But I guarantee you, those folks are always at the career fairs. They're always at the meetups. And they're the ones I find, because they're working, they kind of inherently know, I've got to network, I've got to understand, I've got to reach out. And so they're a lot more likely to kind of find you as well if you do have those requirements. Alexa, what do you think?
Yes, two things. First, to what you were saying, there are definitely people in all of these programs who have 1 to 3 or 5 to 10 years of professional production experience before going back for an advanced degree. So they're definitely on campus. You'll want to target probably master's and PhD programs, but that's where they are. And then secondly, you can also think about building your long-term pipeline, because if you don't think you'll be able to hire them until 2 years after they graduate, you still want to be on their mind. And if they've never heard of you before that, then you're going to have a hard time hiring people who have 2 years of experience, because they're looking at people that, or companies that engaged with them when they were students. So those are my 2 answers. I think definitely worth it.
I just want to chime in on the engineering side, and just that everyone probably already knows this. It's so valuable for like engineering leadership and talent and recruiting to be working closely together, because to some, there's different decisions that each party is making, and it's a very strategic decision, in terms of headcount that maybe engineering leaders are making, of like, what is the composition of our organization, like in order to have all the capabilities we need, short-term, long-term. And so, and that, like Alexa says, this might be more of an incremental process, but hiring is tightly linked to onboarding and is tightly linked to those organizational compositions. So it's a limitation for a company. The smaller, like if you need everyone to fill a certain category, you're just necessarily going to have a more limited recruiting and hiring, and more expensive, hiring potential. So anytime, just for engineering organizational leaders, anytime we can create really long career tracks and find ways to incorporate people into our organizations in productive ways all along that, so that that really expands what we can do. So however you kind of have those kind of conversations and that partnership, that can help long term.
All right, I've got one. The anonymous attendee has one, but I think this is a great one. Any suggestions regarding influencing senior leaders to drop the GPA requirements? That's always been interesting in just recruiting as a whole, especially Tricia, when you mentioned earlier about people who are maybe working as well as going to school versus those who are just primarily just going to school. Makes a difference. So just curious as to whether or not you've ever had the conversations with senior leaders to say, why are we requiring this?
Yeah. I've actually been really fortunate to work at organizations that don't have GPA requirements, possibly because they were started by people that didn't finish their education in some cases. But I've had the conversation, because a lot of times I would see resumes come in from students that were fantastic, except they have this GPA on there. And the first thing I would say to them is like, drop the GPA. Right. And if you are applying to a company that requires it and your GPA isn't high enough, then, you either need to have a one-on-one with that recruiter and kind of, showcase that, or, just drop the GPA. Because there's so many reasons, to your point. You could be working, you could be taking care of family members, you could be going to school during COVID, any number of reasons, right, that you could have, differences in your GPA. And it's really about that story. And so when thinking about influencing senior leaders, again, I kind of come back to, who can you showcase that is the exception and say, this is the talent we would miss out on. Or, you can do an analysis and say, hey, we kind of went through and we did an analysis of different GPA pockets. And we actually found that as a benchmark, these are where people kind of tend to perform the most, because I think a lot of people have in their minds, the higher the GPA, the better. But that's not the case. And it takes away too from, if you're at a company that likes live interviews, GPA is like it's like a test. It's like not having a live interview. You're not getting the whole picture of the person. And so I think having those conversations, showing those people that are exceptions, and saying, you know, here's what we missed out on, right? Look at these profiles, these resumes without GPA. Which ones would you pick? Oh, you'd pick 8 out of 10? Surprise, all their GPAs are lower than our mark. So you can't interview them. So how do you feel about your GPA requirement now? And really showing them what they're missing out on. But you have to have that honest conversation with them and kind of show them the opportunities that are there. Alexa, have you had success in other ways?
This is a hard one. I think it matters so much what the company context is. Sounds like Trisha has been really fortunate to be at companies where that's not much of an issue. I've worked in university recruiting at many companies, and then of course have been on the other side counseling students through this and have seen it from every angle. And it may not always be that easy. I think something that I've talked with employers about, both when I was on the campus side, but also now in the UR side, is what signal are you trying to get from that GPA that you're not finding elsewhere? Because it might be that they don't feel comfortable with what the interviews are giving. Maybe they don't trust the interview feedback, in which case we need to change our interviews. And so that's something I've had success with, in partnering with the teams that develop interview questions and saying, hey, they're, you know, the people who approve offers, the leadership, isn't feeling like they're getting enough signals. So what can we change or tweak, or what like additional question can we add to get this context that isn't, like you said, Trisha, just a checkbox test? This is another one where it takes time. So it's not going to change overnight. You're going to need data, and through really close partnership with your hiring teams and finding those champions, that's how you're going to be able to get some people through, and then do what Trisha just said, just say like, hey, you really like this person, or this group of people we actually hired and didn't have the GPA, but it definitely takes time and matters what your company ethos is.
All right. And there was a gentleman who asked a question in our chat by the name of Benjamin. And now all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I can't seem to find it now. But I think he was asking something specifically about Karat and what some of the things that we're doing. And I would love to share with the entire audience, because I think he was wondering about the success rates just overall. And I'd love to just share with him some of the things that we're doing even for this fall, because I think it certainly has made a difference. As Luce had mentioned earlier in the conversation, Luce and I have been out on the trail for a number of years, going to both historically Black colleges and universities, as well as Hispanic serving institutions. And what we found is that so many times the students there are unable to pass the assessments. And so we know that one of the gaps there is them just not even understanding what the interview process is like. So many of them thought that the interview was actually going to be a behavioral interview when it ended up being a technical interview. And then when the company didn't offer a redo, then all of a sudden they felt insecure even about going for another interview. Well, I will tell you that this fall, I'm pleased to announce that we Karat are going to partner with Howard University, and we're actually going to offer practice interviews for sophomores in a data structures class, for juniors in an algorithms class, and for all the senior class because we want them to get better. And we believe that by giving them additional interviewing experiences is going to help them with the overall interview process, and they'll be more comfortable actually doing interviews with Databricks as well as with Lowe's, because they'll understand what the interview process is like, and it takes away that uncertainty. I call it FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that they can be successful. So we want to open up that opportunity for all of them. But we've had success over at Morehouse, UC Merced, and more specifically CSU Monterey Bay, where we partner with them. And Luce, if you want to talk, I'd love for you to just share a little bit about the program that you did last summer with them, and how successful that has been, and how just having exposure to interviewing more often has made a huge difference for them.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. We're going to have more interesting data coming out soon based on the work we're doing this year. But we definitely see improvement, even just from one interview to the second. We worked with CSU Monterey Bay this past summer, and students were doing practice, programming problems, sort of data structures and algorithms, and we gave them practice interviews at the beginning of the course on the material that they had, sort of learned in the first 3 weeks, and then at the very end. And already we could see big jumps, and that actually helped them that helped bring other professors from other schools on board, just seeing that, hey, this really makes a difference. By using our interviews tend to be very consistent, so it can kind of add credence to that. And I think they're getting NSF funding and potentially rolling that out in a wider way. So that was very promising, and the students enjoy it a great deal, because the students really want to know how are they doing, are they ready, what do they need to work on. So the results are promising, but we will have more coming soon from some of this other work that we're doing.
Right. And if anybody wants to join us on the journey or learn more, then by all means reach out. We'd love to have new partners in this journey, because we think it's absolutely important.
Oh, and 2 things I can call out is that, we do see improvements on when we do redo interviews so, we already have some data about how that can really help. And also how providing guidance and hints and interaction during an interview, I think, I forget the exact data, at least a quarter of our candidates are receiving some kind of interview help and getting offers. So all of that, helping students understand how to even have those conversations, that can be a big step that really helps them, show off their skills, so it's not a false negative.
Right. Yeah. Because Lusta, you do a great job in saying, don't feel so uncomfortable if you get stuck, and you can ask the question, and usually you'll find the right answer, and you're able to finish the interview with being a star instead of giving up on yourself. So.
Yeah, interviewers are often looking for thought processes, and I think even Trisha mentioned like the partial credit can be valuable. So, but how do we can't read people's minds? That's not a competency we can hire for, unfortunately.
Today.
All
right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone, all the panelists. You have been so wonderful to share your words of wisdom, and hopefully all the attendees that were able to gain some wisdom from the things that you shared today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to seeing you on another webinar. And it looks like people are appreciating us being here. So thank you once again, everyone. We enjoyed it this afternoon, and hope to see you again soon on Zoom. And ideally this time next year in person.